The hushed exhalation of unseen apparatus was the only cadence in the dim hospital hallway with no staff, machines quietly breathing. It was a sound that had woven itself into the fabric of my days, a mechanical sigh mirroring the one I held captive in my own chest. Each click and soft hum was a reminder of absence, a hollow echo in the vast, empty chamber of my recent personal loss. I sat on a hard, cold bench, the synthetic fabric clinging faintly to my coat, my gaze fixed on a patch of linoleum scuffed by countless hurried footsteps. The air, sterile and thin, tasted of forgotten grief and nascent decay. I moved through the hours like a phantom, my skin a porous membrane, absorbing the muted suffering of this place, the unspoken tragedies that seeped from behind closed doors. They were beautiful, terrible ghosts. A vibration startled me, a jarring tremor in the pocket of my coat. My phone. The screen glowed with an unfamiliar number. I hesitated, the thought of engaging with the outside world a weary prospect. Who dared intrude upon this carefully constructed edifice of sorrow? I am the executor of the late Elias Blackwood's estate. Elias Blackwood. The name was a phantom limb, a distant, barely remembered branch of my family tree. A great-uncle, perhaps? A second cousin, twice removed? Blackwood's passing, she continued, her tone as dry as autumn leaves. His death was unexpected. As his closest living relative, you have been named the sole beneficiary of his estate, Blackwood Manor. The name hung in the air, a heavy velvet drape. Blackwood Manor. I knew little of it, only fragmented tales from my grandmother's youth, stories of a place both grand and foreboding, nestled deep within forgotten woods, miles from any town. A place where the sun seemed to struggle to penetrate the ancient canopy. An estate? I repeated, the word alien on my tongue. My life was small, contained within the confines of my own quiet apartment, a life stripped bare of all but necessity. An estate felt like a relic from another era, a burden. Indeed, a rather substantial property. Isolated, I must warn you. Decaying in places, but with considerable acreage. There was a pause, a beat of professional impatience. Are you familiar with the property, Marcus? Only vaguely, I admitted, my mind already painting pictures of peeling wallpaper and dust motes dancing in sunbeams that never quite reached the floor. The image was strangely appealing. Isolation, decay, a place where my own inner desolation might find a fitting external landscape. She proceeded to detail the logistics, the legalities, the sheer volume of paperwork. Her words were a drone, a dull hum against the backdrop of the machines breathing around me. But one word caught, snagged in the ragged edges of my grief. Isolated. My apartment, once a haven, had become a cage of ghosts. Every object, every scent, every shaft of light carried the weight of what was lost. I needed to flee, not just from the city, but from the very air that choked me with memory. Not a solution, no, but perhaps a temporary reprieve. To say yes was to step into the unknown, to embrace a legacy shrouded in a distant relative's mysterious death. To say no was to remain here, tethered to a pain that threatened to consume me whole. My fingers tightened around the phone, the plastic digging into my palm. A deep, quiet resolve, born of exhaustion and a desperate need for change, settled over me. This wasn't about wealth or status. It was about distance, about finding a corner of the world where my grief might finally be allowed to breathe without suffocating me. Perhaps, in that forgotten place, I could also forget, or at least begin to mend. Yes, I said, my voice gaining a surprising strength. Yes, I will claim it. I'll take Blackwood Manor. The line clicked, the call ended, and the hallway's quiet breathing resumed its steady rhythm. But now, it sounded different. Not merely the exhalation of machines, but the slow, deliberate intake of a vast, ancient entity. I stood, my legs stiff, and walked towards the exit, away from the sterile scent of grief, towards the promise of an isolated, decaying manor. I knew nothing of the house, nothing of the man who had left it to me, nothing of the packs or prisons it might hold. It was a sound I had come to associate with finality, with the hushed pronouncements that steal the air from a room. But now it felt different, less a backdrop to grief and more a faint, ancient pulse beneath the floorboards of the world. I walked, my steps echoing too loudly, away from the lingering scent of antiseptic and despair, towards a different kind of ending, or perhaps a new beginning cloaked in shadow. The journey was a blur of highway tarmac giving way to winding country lanes, the urban sprawl receding until only the skeletal trees and an endless gray sky remained. Each mile swallowed the last vestiges of civilization, leaving me adrift in a landscape that grew increasingly desolate. The very air seemed to thicken, a palpable silence pressing in, broken only by the hum of the engine, a fragile barrier against the encroaching wilderness. My mind, a fractured mosaic of memories and anxieties, found little solace in the passing scenery. The ghost of her laughter, the echo of our shared dreams, they clung to me like burrs, sharp and persistent. It appeared not as a destination, but as an assertion. A colossal silhouette against the bruised twilight, its gables sharp as broken teeth, its windows like sunken, lightless eyes. Blackwood Manor. The driveway, long overgrown, swallowed the tires of my car, the gravel crunching a dirge beneath the weight. The front door, a heavy oak behemoth scarred by time and weather, groaned open at my touch, a sound like a dying animal. A blast of frigid, stagnant air, thick with the scent of dust, decay, and something else. Something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood and forgotten roses, assaulted my senses. My breath caught in my throat. A grand, sweeping staircase, its banister intricately carved but veiled in a thick shroud of cobwebs, ascended into the gloom, vanishing into the upper floors. Moonlight, fractured and pale, pierced through a high, leaded window, illuminating dancing motes of dust in the vast, still air. The floorboards groaned beneath my weight, a chorus of protest from the ancient timbers. Every creak, every shift of the house seemed amplified, imbued with a strange, deliberate quality. Was that the settling of an old structure or something else? Something listening? I found myself pausing, holding my breath, straining to discern the source of a faint rustle, a subtle scrape that seemed to originate from just beyond the reach of my vision. The parlor, a vast chamber choked with draped furniture, offered a momentary respite from the overwhelming sense of emptiness. I pulled back a heavy sheet from a towering gilded mirror, revealing my own gaunt reflection, a stranger peering back from the silvered glass. Across the room, a wall of portraits stared down. Generations of my lineage, their faces stern, their eyes somehow too knowing. Most were obscured by grime and cobwebs, their features indistinct, but one, larger than the rest, hung slightly askew, as if recently disturbed. I approached it, my footsteps soft on the thick, dust-laden rug. The portrait depicted a woman, her face severe, her gaze fixed on something beyond the frame. Her eyes, painted with unsettling precision, seemed to follow me as I moved, a trick of the light, I told myself, a common optical illusion in old paintings. As I reached out to straighten the frame, my fingers brushed against the wall behind it. It felt different there, less solid. My heart gave a sudden, unwelcome lurch. Within the niche, nestled on a velvet lining faded to a dull crimson, lay a small, leather-bound journal. Its cover was thick, embossed with an unfamiliar, intricate symbol, and a tarnished brass clasp held it firmly shut. No key was visible. This was no mere settling, This was a deliberate unveiling, but this time, no one spoke. Only the slow, mechanical sighing, a sound that etched itself into the tender tissue of my memory, a phantom echo. That hollow quiet was a seed, planted deep, now blooming in the shadowed corners of the ancestral estate. Then, the sounds. Not the usual groans of an ancient structure, but an almost deliberate mimicry of them. A stretched plank here, a sigh of wind there, that seemed to respond to my presence. It was faint at first, the ghost of something familiar, something sweet and green, like the honeysuckle that had climbed the trellis outside my childhood bedroom. A breath of comfort, a cruel deception. I moved towards it, drawn by the spectral fragrance, only for it to curdle, twisting into the cloying sweetness of decay, of something forgotten and left to rot. The house was learning me, it seemed, tracing the contours of my grief, probing the softest parts of my memory. A new determination, sharp and brittle, began to calcify within me. This wasn't merely an old house with a draft. This was something else, something sentient and malevolent. I needed answers. The manor's history, I knew, was as convoluted and overgrown as the ivy that clung to its stone walls. I began in the library, a vast, dust-choked chamber where generations of my lineage had hoarded their secrets. The shelves groaned under the weight of forgotten knowledge. Leather-bound ledgers, brittle journals, and volumes whose spines had long since surrendered their titles to the gnawing passage of time. My fingers, stained with the grime of ages, traced the faded script in a family chronicle, a meticulous but strangely sterile account of births, deaths, and property transfers. It was in the margins, in the terse, almost dismissive annotations, that the true narrative began to emerge. A great-aunt succumbed to a sudden fever after only a few months in residence. A distant cousin lost at sea, though no storm was reported. A series of unfortunate incidents that seemed to cluster around the estate, particularly after a new heir took possession. The language was always careful, euphemistic, designed to obscure rather than reveal. I found a collection of old newspaper clippings, brittle and yellowed, tucked away in a locked desk drawer. One article, dated almost 80 years prior, detailed the tragic accidental death of my great-uncle, the previous owner. He had been found at the bottom of the main staircase, his neck broken. The local constabulary had ruled it a fall, citing his advanced age and failing eyesight. Yet a small, almost imperceptible detail in the article caught my eye. A brief mention of a disturbed state of mind in the weeks leading up to his demise, attributed to his solitude. I remembered the odd, almost playful shoves I'd felt on the stairs, the sense of an unseen hand guiding my descent. The more I read, the more the house seemed to awaken in response. The air grew heavy, thick with a scent like damp earth and old blood. It was as if the entity, whatever it was, knew I was prying, knew I was drawing closer to the truth, and it resented my intrusion with a primal fury. The fragmented accounts, the hushed disappearances, the suspiciously accidental deaths, they were threads, each one a tendril of a vast unseen web. And I, Marcus, was now caught within it. The determination, once brittle, hardened into a desperate resolve. I had inherited more than a house. I had inherited a curse, and the entity that enforced it was already tightening its grip. But this time, the machines were not merely a backdrop to my grief. They were the very air I breathed, a phantom presence that clung to my senses even as I sat in the hushed, cavernous drawing room of the estate. The scent of ozone and antiseptic, an impossible memory, seemed to cling to the ancient velvet of the armchair, mingling with the pervasive aroma of dust and decay. I had fled the city, sought refuge in this crumbling testament to my lineage, hoping the silence here would drown out the echoes of my past. Marcus. A voice, impossibly soft, impossibly dear, brushed against my inner ear. It was her. my wife. The sound was a serrated blade, twisting in the wound that never truly healed. I clenched my jaw, the muscles in my neck tightening until they ached. I knew it wasn't real. It couldn't be. Yet the conviction wavered, a fragile reed in a rising gale. Every gust of wind rattling the leaded panes became a sigh, every groan of the ancient floors a mournful lament. Was that me? The lines around my eyes seemed deeper, etched by an invisible hand. Days bled into a hazy continuum, marked only by the escalating intensity of the mental intrusions. The rhythmic exhalation of the machines would replace the rustle of the wind, and I would taste that acrid chemical tang. One evening, as twilight bled through the tall, grimy windows, painting the room in shades of bruised violet, the assault intensified. But the words swam before my eyes, replaced by images of my past. My son, his laughter like wind chimes, chasing a kite across a sun-drenched field, his small hand warm in mine. Then, the image shifted, contorted, his face pale and still beneath a sheet. The memory was a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. You stood there. My hands were shaking, not just from fear, but from a burgeoning self-loathing. The entity knew. It knew my deepest, most insidious guilt. It plucked at the threads of my self-doubt, weaving them into a suffocating shroud. I stumbled to my feet, the room seeming to tilt around me. Was this truly the entity? Or was I simply unraveling? Had the grief, the isolation, finally broken me? I paced the drawing room, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I felt watched, judged, condemned. I had tried to call a colleague earlier, a friend from my old life, a voice of reason. But the phone had felt impossibly heavy, a dead weight in my trembling hand. What would I say? They would think me mad. I hung up before it could even ring. Isolation, it seemed, was not just a consequence of this place, but a weapon wielded by the unseen horror. The entity had found the cracks in my resolve, the fault lines of my sorrow, and it was prying them open with relentless surgical precision. The house was no longer merely a prison for a malevolent spirit. It was a cage for my mind. And I, Marcus, once determined, now felt the foundations of my sanity begin to crumble, piece by agonizing piece. I was truly alone, besieged from within. The journal lay splayed, an open wound on the polished floorboards. My hands still trembled, a tremor that began in my gut and spread through every nerve, not merely from the chill of the ancient house, but from a burgeoning, sickening self-loathing. The entity knew. It knew my deepest, most insidious failures, my quietest shames, the unspoken grief that gnawed at my marrow, the fragile hopes I clung to like a drowning man to driftwood. It had burrowed, not just into the manor's foundations, but into the very bedrock of my soul. The air grew impossibly heavy, thick and cloying, tasting of ozone and something metallic like old pennies. Then a dizzying lurch, as if the floor had dropped out from beneath me, and the comforting scent of aged paper and dust vanished, replaced by an antiseptic sterility that pierced my nostrils. I was no longer in the library. My feet found purchase on a cold, linoleum-like surface. The air here was still, unnaturally so, yet filled with a low, rhythmic hum, a soft, mechanical exhalation and inhalation that seemed to emanate from the very walls. The walls were a pale, faded green, streaked with what looked like ancient water damage, or perhaps something far more sinister. On either side, doors stood closed, featureless, their thresholds swallowed by the gloom. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. My mind screamed against the impossible shift, yet my senses insisted on its veracity. A promise etched in blood. For power, for prosperity, for unending yield. A soul for the soil, a life for the lineage. My head throbbed, each pulse a hammer blow against the inside of my skull. I saw my ancestors, spectral figures in forgotten finery, gathered in a candlelit chamber deep beneath this very house. Their faces were grim, their eyes alight with a desperate ambition. Another, a man whose features were eerily similar to my own, though twisted by an avarice I hoped I did not share, sliced open his palm, letting crimson droplets fall into the cup. The pact. It was real. A bargain struck with something ancient, something that slumbered beneath the very foundations of the manor. A pact for boundless wealth, for fertile lands, for an unbroken line of heirs. And the cost? A periodic offering, a soul, a sacrifice. The images flashed faster, a dizzying montage of prosperity and then, inevitably, decay. I saw the generations prosper, then falter. I saw the fear in their eyes as the time for the offering drew near. The entity demands its due. A life to nourish, a spirit to bind. The blood must flow, or the pact consumes all. Then, a new vision, piercing through the cacophony. The previous owner. His face, gaunt and haunted, illuminated by the flickering light of a single candle. He was in the library, much as I had been, surrounded by stacks of ancient texts, his hands sifting through brittle pages, desperate for answers. He was trying to break it. I saw his frantic scribblings, his increasingly desperate attempts to find a loophole, a way out of the centuries-old curse. He had failed. The understanding slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. The pact wasn't just a distant historical curiosity. It was a living, breathing mechanism, a clock ticking down to my own demise. The previous owner hadn't just died mysteriously. He had been consumed. His soul claimed to sate the entity's hunger, to renew the terms of the vile agreement. But beneath it, a spark ignited, a fierce, unyielding resolve. I wouldn't be another victim. I wouldn't allow my lineage to continue this cycle of horror. This sterile, endless hallway, this vision of ancestral damnation, was meant to break me. But it only clarified my purpose. The entity knew my fears, but it didn't know the depth of my determination. I would unravel this unholy pact, even if it meant tearing the very house down around me. The rhythmic breathing of the machines ceased. Then, with a gasp, the world solidified around me. The smell of old paper and dust filled my lungs. The journal lay open before me, its pages stark white in the dim light of the library. I was back, but I was no longer the same. I knew the truth, and I would fight. His desperate search through brittle pages echoed my own burgeoning need. The revelation, sharp and cold, settled deep within my bones. A fierce, desperate resolve ignited within me, a flickering wick against the encroaching gloom. I would not succumb. If the answers lay buried in dusty tomes, then I would exhume them. My grief, a familiar companion, now sharpened into a weapon, fueling an urgency that thrummed beneath my skin. The library became my sanctuary and my battleground. I worked tirelessly, my fingers growing stained with the grime of centuries. Hours bled into an indistinguishable blur. My eyes, gritty and burning, scanned page after page, hinted at a binding, a pact of blood and earth. There were references to the tether, the lineage, but no clear explanation, no precise ritual, no weakness to exploit. The entity, sensing my burgeoning defiance, began to press in with an unnerving intensity. I was hunched over a particularly dense, leather-bound book, its pages brittle as dried leaves, when the air suddenly thickened, growing heavy and viscous, as if I had plunged into an unseen pool. The words on the page blurred, then dissolved into a swirling mist. The library vanished. The walls around me were a muted, institutional beige, stretching into an endless, desolate corridor. The light above was not the warm glow of my lantern, but a harsh, fluorescent glare that seemed to leach all color from the world, leaving everything stark and lifeless. The air tasted of antiseptic and fear. My breath hitched. My throat tightened. This was no memory, no mere echo. This was a direct assault, a cruel conjuring of my deepest vulnerability, a world designed to amplify the grief that still gnawed at me. The entity knew. I tried to move, to run, but my limbs felt heavy, anchored to the spot. The machines breathed on, an endless mechanical sigh, a dirge for something lost and irrevocably gone. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the vision fractured. The beige walls rippled, the sterile scent evaporated, and the hiss-click faded into a distant murmur. I gasped, stumbling back, my hand flying to my chest, where my heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I was back in the library, slumped over the ancient text, my lantern casting its feeble light. It was no longer empty. It was pregnant with a watching presence, a malevolent awareness that had just shown me the true depth of its reach. The search for answers suddenly felt less like an academic pursuit and more like a desperate, bloody struggle. The warnings in the texts, once abstract, now resonated with a terrifying immediacy. The entity was not waiting. It was actively engaging, twisting my reality, eroding my sanity. The pact was real. The entity was real. And I, Marcus, was its chosen prey. The sun was setting, painting the leaded glass windows in hues of bruised purple and blood orange, and the house seemed to sigh, a long, anticipatory breath. I was the latest offering. The thought, a cold, sharp blade, pierced through the thin veil of my fading denial. My breath hitched, a ragged sound in the profound quiet of the manor. The previous owner's gaunt face, etched with a despair I now understood, became a specter haunting the periphery of my vision, his desperate search through brittle pages echoing my own burgeoning need. I had to break free. My fingers, trembling despite my forced resolve, fumbled for the old rotary phone in the study. The landline, I remembered with a jolt of panic, had been dead for days, a minor inconvenience I dismissed as the house's general decay. I tried my mobile phone, its screen a dim, mocking rectangle in my palm. No signal, not even a flicker of a bar. I walked to the window, then to another, pressing the device against the cold glass as if seeking a phantom frequency. Nothing. It wasn't just the house. It was it, the entity. Its reach extended beyond the crumbling walls, a suffocating shroud cast over the entire estate. I thought of my car, parked uselessly in the overgrown drive. I had tried it this morning, a desperate, futile twist of the key in the ignition. The battery, I'd assumed. Another coincidence. But the sheer accumulation of these coincidences had begun to form a pattern, an intricate web spun with malicious intent. A sudden, dizzying wave washed over me, a sickening lurch like the deck of a ship in a storm. The study walls seemed to ripple, the antique furniture blurring into indistinct shapes. My vision swam, then coalesced, not into the familiar gloom of the manor, but into a stark, unfamiliar vista. Empty gurneys, their chrome glinting dully, stood sentinel against the walls, their plastic mattresses indented as if recently vacated. Each closed door I passed seemed to hold a secret, a hushed chamber of suffering or stillness. Where was I? How had I arrived here? It wasn't a person. It was tall, impossibly slender, and as it drew nearer, I could discern the faintest outline of limbs, stretched and attenuated, as if seen through warped glass. There were no discernible features, no face, no eyes. Yet I felt its gaze, a terrible, penetrating force that stripped away my defenses. You cannot leave. This was it. Its presence was a suffocating weight, an ancient malevolence that had found its latest anchor in me. It was feeding, not on my body, but on my very essence, on the raw, open wounds of my soul. It wasn't just trapping me physically, it was dismantling me from within. I stumbled backward, a guttural cry tearing from my throat, though no sound escaped my lips in this silent, spectral hall. The antiseptic scent vanished, replaced by the familiar damp smell of old stone and decay. The old phone, forgotten, lay on the desk. My mobile, clutched in my hand, was still stubbornly signalless. I was back. But the experience, sharp and terrifying, had left a residue, a psychic bruise. There was no escape. Not through the phone, not through the car, and certainly not through the fragile sanctuary of my own mind. The non-English words still echoed, a discordant symphony within the hollow chambers of my skull. The entity, in its rawest form, had pressed itself against the thin membrane of my reality, and I felt the fabric tear. Then the suffocating weight shifted, not lessening, but transforming, stretching into a new dimension of unease. This was a place born of the entity's will, a deliberate construct designed to unnerve. The light, a sickly yellow filtered from unseen sources, painting the peeling paint a jaundiced hue. The air was thick with the sterile tang of antiseptic, overlaid by something metallic and coppery, like old blood. My breath hitched, not from exertion, but from the sheer wrongness of it all. The machines. They lined the walls, hulking forms of tarnished chrome and opaque glass, their wires snaking across the floor like metallic vines. They weren't the familiar, comforting shapes of life support, but something ancient, almost alchemical. Their quiet breathing was a rhythmic hiss and click, a low, mechanical pulse that vibrated through the very soles of my feet. It sounded like the world itself was struggling to inhale and exhale, trapped in some agonizing stasis. There was no one, not a single soul, yet the space thrummed with an unseen presence, a profound emptiness that felt heavier than any crowd. My mind, though battered, clung to a thread of purpose. This was a test, a revelation. The entity had brought me here for a reason. I moved forward, my footsteps muffled by the unnatural silence, each sound swallowed by the breathing machines. The walls were scarred, not just by age, but by something more deliberate. Faint etchings, almost invisible in the poor light, began to emerge as my eyes adjusted. They were intricate symbols, swirling patterns that seemed to writhe and interlock, pulsing faintly with the same sickly yellow light. These weren't mere decorations. They were sigils, wards, a desperate language of containment. And as I followed their winding path along the corridor, the machines began to hum with a greater intensity, their quiet breathing becoming a guttural rasp. Images flickered across their opaque glass surfaces, not reflections, but projections from within. I saw him. He was in a space that mirrored this one, though perhaps cruder, more primal. He moved with a frenetic energy, his hands trembling, working over similar devices, though theirs were crude iron and bone. The projections showed not just his actions, but his thoughts, his agonizing internal monologue. He spoke of a binding, of anchoring the hunger. Then, the true horror unfurled. The ancestor was not merely containing the entity, he was feeding it, or rather redirecting its insatiable appetite. The images shifted, became sharper, more visceral. I saw a small, innocent figure, a child, no older than 5, with wide, trusting eyes. The ancestor, my own blood, was not sacrificing the child's life, but something far more insidious. Not to kill it, but to appease it, to give it a focus, a constant low-level sustenance that would keep it from consuming everything else. It would live, but as a shell, its very soul a tether to the unspeakable. This was the pact. This was the containment. A living sacrifice, renewed through generations, a constant drip feed of innocence to keep the greater beast at bay. My ancestor had not vanquished the entity. He had merely recaged it, and the key was a child's stolen spirit. The air grew heavy, thick as tar. The machine's breathing accelerated, a frantic panting. The entity, though unseen, pressed in, its presence a suffocating blanket woven from despair and ancient hunger. It was showing me the way, the only way, it seemed, that my lineage had found to survive. This was the forbidden knowledge, the secret that had damned my family for centuries. And now, it was offered to me. The implied choice was clear, stark, and utterly horrifying. I could continue this cycle, find an innocent, perform the binding, and perhaps buy myself a semblance of peace, a temporary reprieve from the entity's gnawing presence. Or I could refuse, break the pact, and unleash the full, unbridled horror, not just upon myself, but upon the world beyond these walls. The cost of salvation, I realized with a sickening jolt, was the damnation of another. The choice was not merely between life and death, but between my soul and the soul of someone else. The ancestors' cruel deception, a truth etched in spectral light, had seared itself into my mind. A child, an innocent, offered to the gaping maw of the house's ravenous occupant. This was no longer just about survival. It was about vengeance, about severing a lineage of horror. My hands, though trembling, moved with a newfound purpose. The old texts lay splayed on the dust-choked table, their brittle pages whispering forgotten incantations. I had spent the last hours poring over them, searching not for escape, but for a weapon. The ritual, complex and fraught with peril, demanded a sacrifice, not of life, but of connection. To break the binding, to sever the entity's tether to this land, to my blood. It spoke of a vessel, a conduit, and a final, irreversible act of severance. A cold dread seeped into the very marrow of my bones, not from the entity itself, but from the chilling clarity of what I had to do. The house groaned around me, a living thing sensing my intent. The air grew thick, heavy with an unseen presence, pressing down like a shroud. I could feel its gaze, a hungry, ancient stare, piercing through the walls, through my very skin. It knew. It had always known. My focus blurred. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs as the world around me twisted. The air, unnaturally still, carried the faint metallic scent of ozone and something cloying like wilting lilies. The walls were a faded institutional green, peeling in places, scarred by unseen impacts. On either side, doors stood closed and identical, each bearing a small, tarnished brass plaque, too far to read. It was an empty, echoing tomb, yet filled with the phantom pulse of lingering despair. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. The entity, it was trying to break me, to trap me in a nightmare of its own making. I forced my gaze to the floor, where the familiar pattern of the study's rug should have been. Instead, cracked linoleum stretched before me, stained and scarred. Not in my ears, but directly inside my mind, a soft, insistent murmur that spoke of longing, of abandonment. I followed it, compelled, down the desolate corridor. The toop grew louder, more insistent, drawing me closer to one particular door. As I reached it, the tarnished brass plaque shimmered, and the name etched upon it seemed to coalesce before my eyes, though it was not a name I knew, but a word. Vessel. A wave of nausea washed over me. The whisper intensified, transforming into a faint, childlike whimper, a sound so utterly forlorn it pierced through my defenses. The whimpering was definitely coming from within, accompanied by the persistent, mechanical shh-tup. And then, I heard it clearly, a fragile, barely audible voice, repeating a single word, Papa. A jolt of pure horror seized me. This wasn't just a vision of a child. This was the child. The one from the ancestors' memories. The one used as a conduit. The entity wasn't merely feeding on fear or life force. It was feeding on innocence, on love, on the very fabric of human connection. The ancestor hadn't just redirected its appetite. He had cultivated it, nurtured it, twisted it into something unspeakably vile. The child's papa. It wasn't a random cry. It was a plea, a betrayal, a lingering echo of the ultimate sacrifice. The vessel was not just a means to an end. It was a living, breathing being, utterly consumed. The ancestral pact wasn't just about containment. It was about perpetuation, a cycle of agony. The air in the hallway grew frigid, biting at my exposed skin. The walls seemed to press inward, the ceiling to lower, crushing me with the weight of this awful revelation. The shh-tup escalated into a frantic gasp, then a desperate choking wheeze. This wasn't just a battle for my soul. It was for every innocent soul entangled in this monstrous lineage. The entity sought to break me, to drown me in despair, to make me another willing participant in its gruesome feast. The ritual, dangerous as it was the only way. The vision of the dim hallway began to fracture, lines of light appearing at its edges, like cracks in a fragile illusion. The rhythmic wheeze of the machines faded, replaced by the ominous creaks and groans of the manor. I pushed through the dissolving hallucination, my mind screaming defiance. I was back in the study, the ancient texts spread before me, the gaslight flickering a pale orange. The words of the ritual seemed to burn on the page, each one a step towards a precipice. I knew now the true cost, the true horror of what had been done. And I knew, with a terrible certainty, that I would not let it happen again. The final stand was upon me. I would either break the chain or become its next link. The world was a fractured pane of glass, each shard a scream I couldn't quite hear, a memory I couldn't quite grasp. My eyelids, heavy as leaden doors, peeled open to a muted, sterile light. I was lying down, the cool, unfamiliar surface beneath me offering no comfort. The silence was not peaceful. It hummed with an unnatural tension, like a stretched wire about to snap. The air, thin and metallic, scraped against my raw throat with every shallow breath. My body ached with a deep, bone-weary exhaustion, as if every sinew had been stretched to its breaking point and beyond. I tried to move, but my limbs responded with the sluggish protest of a puppet whose strings had been severed and clumsily retied. A flicker of memory, sharp and agonizing, pierced through the haze. The child, the conduit, the insatiable maw of the entity, feeding, twisting, corrupting. The image was a knife turning in an already festering wound. I remembered the desperate primal scream that tore from my own lungs, a sound born of pure, unadulterated horror and a furious, protective rage. I remembered a searing pain, a blinding flash, and then nothing but this desolate quiet. What had I done? Had I truly broken free? Or had I merely traded one cage for another, albeit one with cleaner walls and less overt malevolence? My mind struggled to reconstruct the final moments. There was the overwhelming presence of the entity, a suffocating darkness that pressed in from all sides, whispering my deepest fears, showing me the faces of my lost loved ones, warped and grotesque. Then, a desperate surge, a defiant act born of a profound refusal to let it claim another innocent. A desperate, almost suicidal lunge towards the source of its power, a desperate attempt to sever the connection, to break the pact. I pushed myself up, groaning as a fresh wave of dizziness washed over me. My fingers felt alien, stiff. As they brushed against my forehead, I felt a coarse, dried crust. Blood. A trophy, perhaps, from the battle I barely remembered. The machines in the hallway continued their quiet, rhythmic breathing. A soft whir-click, whir-click. A low, steady beep from a distant room. Each sound, benign in its intent, twisted into something sinister in my overwrought state. They were monitors, silent sentinels, watching, waiting. But for what? For whom? There was no attendant, no colleague, no stranger, just the endless muted corridor stretching into an indistinct grayness at either end. It was an escape, yes, but into a vacuum. My gaze fell upon my left forearm. There, just beneath the sleeve of my tattered shirt, a mark had bloomed. It wasn't a bruise or a scratch. It pulsed with a subtle internal glow that only I could perceive. This wasn't a wound. It was an impression, a brand. The entity's lingering touch, perhaps, or a deeper, more insidious connection. I had escaped the manor, perhaps even destroyed its physical manifestation. But had I truly escaped it? Or had it merely found a new vessel, a new prison within me? The entity had fed on innocence, on love. It had sought to corrupt the very essence of human connection. And I, in my desperate struggle, had confronted it head-on. What had it taken from me in those final moments? What part of my soul, what fragment of my humanity had I sacrificed to achieve this desolate freedom? I slid off the gurney, my legs wobbly, threatening to give way. Each step was an act of sheer will. I was free, yet the chains of my experience felt heavier than ever. The pact, the bloodline, the feeding. My hand went to the brand on my arm again, tracing its delicate, terrible lines. It had merely changed its form, its location. My escape was not a liberation. It was merely the first step into a new, more intimate kind of haunting. A profound emptiness resonated, a hollow chamber where my very essence once thrummed. The air, thin and metallic, carried the faint scent of antiseptic, a clean, sharp counterpoint to the decaying breath of Blackwood Manor that still clung to the edges of my perception. Long, pale walls stretched into an endless perspective, punctuated by silent, closed doors. No footsteps echoed. No voices disturbed the profound stillness. I was alone, adrift in this purgatorial passage, days blurred into a single stretched moment of quiet solitude. A kind attendant, her face a soft blur, would sometimes appear, bringing sustenance, speaking in hushed tones I barely registered. I learned later that the authorities, after finding me in the derelict manor, had deemed me in need of careful observation. Blackwood, they said, was now sealed, an official investigation underway into its structural integrity and the mysterious circumstances surrounding my relative's demise. I offered no explanations, for what words could capture the tendrils of cold dread, the whispering shadows, the pact etched in blood and bone? And perhaps it was. Eventually, they released me. Not to a new home, but to a new city, far from the suffocating embrace of the ancestral lands. I sought anonymity, a quiet corner where the past could not reach. I found a small apartment, overlooking a street alive with the indifferent bustle of commerce and human endeavor. Here, the sun streamed through clean windows, unfiltered by ancient grime. Here, the air smelled of exhaust fumes and freshly baked bread, not of earth and decay. I began to rebuild, brick by painstaking brick, a semblance of a life. I took a job in a quiet office, arranging figures on spreadsheets, a mundane ritual that grounded me in the tangible. The colleagues were polite, their conversations light, untainted by the specters that haunted my own inner landscape. I ate regular meals, walked along the river, and read books that offered escape into worlds less terrifying than my own memory. The scent of damp earth, of something ancient and metallic, would occasionally prick the air, even indoors, even with the windows sealed. I would dismiss it as phantom, a trauma response, a trick of the mind. One evening, weeks after my supposed liberation, I sat by my window, watching the city lights glitter like scattered jewels. A weariness, deeper than physical exhaustion, settled upon me. I raised a hand to rub my eyes, and as my fingers brushed my temple, I felt it. A slight unevenness, a raised ridge of skin just above my left eyebrow, beneath the hairline. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to the touch, certainly invisible to the casual glance. I had never noticed it before. I walked to the bathroom, the fluorescent lights stark and unforgiving. Leaning close to the mirror, I parted my hair, my fingers tracing the faint scar. It wasn't angry or red, but a pale, almost silvery line, like a thin, healed incision. And then, as I angled my head, the light caught it just so, revealing not merely a line, but a faint, almost subliminal pattern within the scar tissue. It was a symbol. A delicate, intricate knot, familiar yet terrifyingly out of place. It was the same design I had seen etched into the crumbling stone above the manor's great fireplace, the one that adorned the ancient, leather-bound texts I had uncovered in the forgotten library, the very sigil that bound the entity to Blackwood, the mark of the family pact. My breath hitched. My reflection stared back. Marcus, yet not entirely Marcus. His eyes, though weary, held a new depth, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in their light. The entity had not merely been confined to the manor. It had marked me, not as a victim, perhaps, but as something else entirely. A vessel? A conduit? I reached out, my fingers pressing against the cold glass, touching the faint, silvery brand on my reflected self. The city outside continued its indifferent hum, oblivious to the quiet horror unfurling within my small apartment. It had merely found a new host, a new stage. They were a part of me, forever.